Let us begin not in Buenos Aires. Let us begin in a place that has no name anymore. A place that existed thousands of years before the first Spanish ship ever touched South American soil. Close your eyes for a second and imagine a vast, endless grassland. No cities, no roads, no borders, just wind, just grass moving like ocean waves, just the sound of hooves and the smell of earth after rain. This is the Pampas, and it has been alive, breathing, bleeding, remembering, for over 15,000 years. 15,000 years. Let that number sit in your chest for a moment. While Europe was still figuring out agriculture, while the pyramids of Egypt were nothing but a distant dream, human beings were already walking across this land. They were hunting giant ground sloths the size of modern elephants. They were tracking the Macrauchenia, a creature so strange it looked like a camel designed by someone who had never seen a camel. They built no stone monuments. They left no written records. But they left something far more permanent. They left their DNA inside the soil of this continent. And more importantly, they left it inside the people who came after them. These were the first Argentines, and history almost completely erased them. Now here is where the story gets cruel, and I need you to feel this because it is important. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, and yes, we are talking about the 1500s, 5 centuries ago, they did not find an empty land. They found nations, real, complex, sophisticated human nations. The Mapuche in the south, the Quechua-speaking peoples in the northwest, the Guarani in the northeast, the Tehuelche on the Patagonian steppe, the Huichi, the Diaguita, the Comechingon, dozens of different peoples, dozens of different languages, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about this land, its seasons, its animals, its rivers, its medicine. And what happened to them? War happened. Disease happened. Forced labor happened. Missions happened. Those strange religious prisons disguised as salvation. And then, in the 1800s, something even darker happened. The Argentine government launched what they openly called the conquest of the desert. A military campaign, a systematic hunt. Soldiers riding south and west, pushing indigenous communities off their ancestral lands, killing the ones who resisted, enslaving the women and children who survived. General Julio Argentino Roca led this campaign and was celebrated as a national hero. His face was printed on the 100-peso bill for generations. Think about that. The man who organized the near extermination of indigenous Argentines was honored on the national currency. That is not just a historical footnote. That is a statement that said, these people did not exist. This land was empty. We built everything from nothing. But DNA does not accept that statement. DNA calls it what it is, a lie. Because here is what the geneticists discovered when they started testing the Argentine population seriously. And we are talking about major studies done in the 2000s and 2010s. Large-scale population studies involving thousands of participants across different provinces. What they found was extraordinary. When scientists tested the mitochondrial DNA of Argentine people, and remember, mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child, generation after generation, an unbroken biological thread going back tens of thousands of years. They found that over 50% of Argentines carry indigenous American female lineages. Over 50%. in a country that spent 2 centuries telling the world it was European. Let that be your first earthquake of this story. Because we are only just getting started. The maternal line, the line of the mother, the grandmother, the great-grandmother disappearing into the deep past. That line in the majority of Argentines does not lead to Spain. It does not lead to Italy. It does not cross the Atlantic Ocean at all. It goes the other direction. It goes deeper into this continent. It whispers in a language older than Spanish, older than Latin, older than any European tongue. It whispers from 15,000 years ago, from the Pampas, from the Andes, from the forests of the Northeast. And this is where the paradox of Argentina becomes almost unbearable in its beauty and its tragedy at the same time. You see, there is a concept in genetics and anthropology called elite dominance, or sometimes it is called language shift without blood shift, and it is one of the most powerful and underappreciated forces in all of human history. Here is how it works. A relatively small group of people, soldiers, colonizers, missionaries, administrators, arrives in a new land. They have military power. They have political power. They have economic power. They do not need to replace the entire population. They just need to control it. And over generations, the conquered people begin to speak the conqueror's language. They take the conqueror's religion. They take the conqueror's surnames. They begin to dress like the conqueror, cook like the conqueror, celebrate the conqueror's holidays. But their blood changes much more slowly. Their blood remembers. Their blood keeps the ancient account open, even when the conscious mind has forgotten everything. This is exactly what happened in Argentina. The Spanish language spread, the Catholic Church spread, European surnames spread. But underneath all of that, in the mitochondria of Argentine mothers, in the Y chromosomes of Argentine fathers in certain regions, the old world survived. Hidden, patient, waiting for science to finally give it a voice. And now science has spoken. And the voice is ancient, and it is powerful, and it changes everything about how we understand this country. But wait, because now we need to go even deeper. Because the indigenous legacy is only one layer of this genetic story. And Argentina, this land, this impossible, beautiful, contradictory land, has more layers than any simple narrative can hold. Let us talk about the Y chromosome now. Because if mitochondrial DNA is the mother's story, the Y chromosome is the father's story. And here the picture looks very different. When scientists analyzed the paternal lineages of Argentine men, they found something that seems to contradict everything we just said. The majority of Y chromosome lineages in Argentina, roughly 60 to 70% depending on the region, are European, mostly Spanish, some Italian, some other Western European. This means that in terms of the direct male line, Argentina does look heavily European. And this is where the genetic detective story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Because what this data is actually telling us, when you put the maternal and paternal lines together, is a story of profound asymmetry. A story of European men and indigenous women. A story of colonization written not just in history books, but in chromosomes. The Spanish men came. The indigenous men were killed or displaced, and the children born from those unions. They carried European surnames. They spoke Spanish. They identified as colonial subjects. but their mothers were the daughters of the Pampas, the Andes, the ancient forests. Argentina was not built by Europeans who replaced a population. Argentina was built on the bodies and the bloodlines of women whose names history never recorded. This is not comfortable, but it is true. And truth, even when it burns, is always more valuable than a comfortable lie. Now let us move to something that will surprise you even further, because we have not yet talked about a third river that flows through Argentine blood. A river that most people, even Argentines themselves, almost never mention when they talk about their national identity. Africa. Yes, Africa. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to the Rio de la Plata region, to Buenos Aires, to Córdoba, to the interior provinces. They worked on farms. They worked in households. They built the early economy of colonial Argentina with their hands and their suffering. At certain points in the early 1800s, and we are talking about the period right around Argentine independence, Afro-Argentines made up between 25 and 30% of the population of Buenos Aires. 25 to 30%. In a city that today has almost no visible African-descended community. So where did they go? This is one of the most haunting mysteries in all of South American demographic history. And the answer involves several forces working together in a devastating combination. Yellow fever epidemics hit Afro-Argentine communities particularly hard in the 1870s. The War of the Triple Alliance, that catastrophic conflict fought between Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay in the 1860s, consumed a disproportionate number of Afro-Argentine men who were pushed into military service. And then came the great wave of European immigration, millions of Italians and Spaniards arriving between 1880 and 1930, demographically overwhelming the existing population. But the Afro-Argentine community did not simply disappear. It was absorbed. Slowly, quietly, generation by generation, it dissolved into the general Argentine population through intermarriage and the brutal social pressure to become invisible, to become European, to survive in a society that had decided blackness was something to be erased. And today, when geneticists look at the African genetic signatures in the Argentine population, they find them present, sometimes subtle, sometimes more visible, scattered across the country. A genetic echo of a community that was systematically made invisible. A whisper of hundreds of thousands of human beings whose descendants walk the streets of Buenos Aires today without knowing this part of their own story. This is the Argentina that DNA reveals. Not the Paris of South America, not the European transplant, but a living mosaic, indigenous, European, African, layered over 15,000 years of human presence on one of the most extraordinary pieces of land on this planet. When geneticists began analyzing specific communities in certain provinces of Argentina, particularly in the northwest, in places like Santiago del Estero and parts of Córdoba and San Juan, they found genetic signals that made absolutely no sense at first glance, signals that did not match indigenous American DNA, signals that did not match Spanish or Italian colonial DNA, signals that were older, and much more traveled. They found traces of Middle Eastern genetic lineages, not recent, not from modern immigration, ancient, deeply ancient, woven into the population so thoroughly that it could only have arrived centuries ago, not decades. And when the scientists began pulling on this thread, carefully, methodically, the way a good detective follows a lead through a city they do not know, what unraveled was one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire genetic history of the Americas. Stay with me, because this is where the story becomes something else entirely. You have to understand something about the Spanish Empire that most history classes never teach you properly. When Spain sent its conquistadors and settlers to the New World in the 1500s and 1600s, Spain was not a simple country. Spain was a place that had just spent 700 years as a battlefield between Christianity and Islam. 700 years of the Reconquista. 700 years of Christians, Muslims, and Jews living together, fighting together, converting together, intermarrying together, and then being violently separated by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. 1492. The same year Columbus sailed west. The same year the Jews were expelled from Spain. The same year the last Muslim kingdom of Granada fell. Coincidence? Absolutely not. It was a single political moment. The creation of a new, unified Christian Spanish identity required the elimination of everything that was not Christian. Jews who refused to convert were expelled. Muslims who refused to convert were expelled. But many thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, converted. They became conversos, new Christians. People who wore Christianity on the outside while sometimes maintaining older traditions in secret, inside their homes, behind closed doors. And then those conversos boarded ships and sailed to the New World. Because the New World was far from the Spanish Inquisition, far from the neighbors who knew your family's history, far from the officials who watched whether you lit candles on Friday night or ate pork or faced a certain direction when you prayed. In the New World, you could become someone new. You could bury your past so deep that even your own children would not know it. And buried it is, for centuries, in the blood. This is what the geneticists found. The Middle Eastern genetic signal in certain Argentine communities is not random. It clusters in specific family networks in specific regions. It correlates with surnames that appear in colonial records as converso families. It correlates with folk practices that researchers have documented in isolated rural communities in Santiago del Estero. The lighting of candles on Friday evenings without knowing why. The avoidance of certain foods passed down as family custom without religious explanation. The practice of washing hands before meals in a specific ceremonial way that has no obvious Catholic origin. These communities had no conscious knowledge of Jewish or Moorish ancestry. They identified as Catholic. They had been Catholic for 500 years, but in their mitochondrial DNA, in the deep maternal line that carries memory without language, the ancient Middle Eastern signal persisted, quiet, patient, waiting for science to give it a name. This is what scientists call genetic memory, the body remembering what the mind was forced to forget. And when the researchers published these findings, something remarkable happened in certain Argentine communities. Families began to look differently at their old customs. Grandmothers were asked about Friday candles. Old family recipes were examined for what they conspicuously avoided. Surnames were traced back through colonial records to Spain and Portugal, and further back to Jewish communities of medieval Iberia. And some of these families, not all, but some, began the process of what is called in Hebrew anusim, the return. The return of people whose ancestors were forced to abandon their identity 500 years ago. The genetics did not just reveal the past. For some people, it changed the present. But we must return now to the larger picture. Because Argentina's genetic story is not finished with any single revelation. Every time you think you have found the final layer, another one appears beneath it. And this next layer is perhaps the most misunderstood of all. Let us talk about the gaucho. The gaucho is the most powerful symbol of Argentine national identity. More than the tango, more than the football, more than the steak and the wine and the mate. The gaucho is the soul of Argentina as Argentina imagines itself. The lone horseman of the pampas. Free, fearless, connected to the land, answering to no one. The Argentine cowboy. Every Argentine child learns about the gaucho. Argentine literature celebrates him in the epic poem Martin Fierro, written in the 1870s by José Hernández, which is sometimes called the Argentine Bible. The gaucho represents independence and authenticity, and a specifically Argentine relationship with the natural world. And the gaucho is genetically one of the most fascinating populations in the entire country. Because who was the gaucho, really? Strip away the mythology and look at the historical record, and you find something unexpected. The gaucho was not a European settler. The gaucho was not a noble Spanish horseman taming the wilderness. The gaucho was, in the vast majority of cases, a mestizo. A person of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, predominantly male, who lived on the margins of colonial society precisely because colonial society had no place for people who did not fit into its racial categories. The gaucho emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries from the mixing of Spanish men with indigenous women of the pampas. He learned to ride horses. Horses brought by Europeans, but quickly mastered by indigenous peoples, with a skill that surpassed anything the Spanish colonizers could manage. He learned to hunt the wild cattle of the pampas with techniques adapted from indigenous hunting traditions. He spoke Spanish, but his cultural knowledge of the land came from his indigenous maternal heritage. He was, in other words, the living embodiment of Argentine genetic admixture long before anyone invented that phrase. And Argentina chose this mixed blood, marginalized colonial outcast as its national symbol. Think about the extraordinary irony of that. Argentina built its national identity on a symbol that was, at its genetic core, the proof of everything Argentine nationalism tried to deny. The gaucho says we are European. The DNA of the gaucho says otherwise. Now let us go even deeper into the pampas, not geographically, but temporally. Further back in time than the gaucho, further back than the Spanish, further back than even the indigenous civilizations that greeted the conquistadors. Because there is a question that haunts Argentine archaeology and has only recently begun to be answered by genetics. How did the first humans arrive here? For decades, the standard answer was simple. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia to Alaska approximately 15,000 years ago. They moved south through an ice-free corridor between the great glaciers of North America. They spread through the continent over several thousand years. They reached Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego approximately 12 to 13,000 years ago. End of story. But the archaeology kept refusing to cooperate with this tidy narrative. Sites in Monteverde in Chile were dated to 14,600 years ago. that is older than the ice-free corridor was supposed to be open. Sites in Brazil showed evidence of human presence even earlier. And in Argentina, at a site called Piedra Museo in Patagonia, human artifacts were found dating to 13,000 years ago, alongside the bones of extinct megafauna. The same giant ground sloths and ancient horses that we mentioned at the beginning of this story. The timeline was wrong. The first Argentines arrived earlier than the textbook said, and they may have taken a different route. The coastal migration hypothesis. Scientists now believe that at least some of the first Americans did not walk through an ice-free interior corridor. They traveled by water, boats or rafts moving along the Pacific coastline, hugging the kelp forests that provided food and resources, moving southward from Alaska to Chile to Patagonia in a maritime migration that left almost no archaeological trace because the ancient coastlines are now underwater, drowned by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. These were the true first Argentines, maritime nomads from the edge of the world, people who crossed an ocean not by accident, but by deliberate, skilled navigation. People whose descendants walked to the tip of Tierra del Fuego and looked south across the Drake Passage toward Antarctica and had nowhere left to go. Their genetic descendants are alive in Argentina today, concentrated in the southernmost populations, carrying mitochondrial haplogroups so ancient and so specifically South American that they represent genetic lineages that have been isolated on this continent for more than 12,000 years. 12,000 years of mothers passing their genetic legacy to daughters in an unbroken chain that connects a woman alive today in Argentine Patagonia to a woman who stood on this same land when woolly mammoths still walked the earth in the northern hemisphere. That is not history. That is something older than history has words for. And yet even this extraordinary depth of time is not the full story. Because genetics has one more revelation waiting for us in Argentina. One more discovery that reframes everything. And it concerns not where the first Argentines came from, but what happened to the genetic diversity they carried when they arrived. Scientists studying the mitochondrial diversity of indigenous South American populations found something deeply troubling. The genetic diversity of indigenous peoples in South America is significantly lower than it should be given the length of time humans have inhabited the continent. This low diversity is the genetic fingerprint of catastrophe. It is the signature of a population that went through a bottleneck, a dramatic collapse in numbers, sometime in the past. The question is when? And the answer that the data suggests is not the Spanish conquest of the 1500s. The collapse appears to have begun earlier, perhaps much earlier, and it may be connected to the extinction of the megafauna. When the giant ground sloths and the ancient horses and the mastodons disappeared from the Americas approximately 10,000 years ago, possibly hunted to extinction by the very first Americans. The human populations that depended on these animals for food may have experienced their own crisis. A famine written in the genes. A catastrophe so ancient that no human memory preserves it, only the reduced diversity of the DNA that survived it. Argentina carries the genetic memory of a disaster that happened 10,000 years before Buenos Aires existed, before Spain existed, before Rome existed. A wound in the human genome that is still visible today if you know how to read it. And this is the Argentina that science reveals when it looks past the tango and the football and the Italian surnames, and the Paris boulevards. This is the true depth of this country. Not 200 years old, not 500 years old, but 15,000 years old at minimum, and connected through its genetic lineages to human journeys that began in Africa 200,000 years ago and wound their way around the entire planet before converging on this extraordinary piece of land at the bottom of the world. And now we arrive at the final question. The question that all of this science, all of this archaeology, all of this genetic detective work has been building toward. Not where did the Argentine people come from? We know that now. From everywhere. From the deepest African origins of humanity, through Siberia and across the Bering Coast, through medieval Iberia and the Converso ships, through the slave ports of West Africa, through the Italian villages and Spanish towns of the 19th century immigration wave. From everywhere and across every conceivable length of time. The real question is this: what does it mean? What does it mean to be Argentine when your blood tells a story completely different from your national mythology? What does it mean to celebrate European identity when your mother's 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 mother, going back 50 generations, was a woman of the Pampas who had never heard the word Europe? What does it mean to mourn the erasure of indigenous peoples when the genetic data says those peoples are not erased at all? They are inside you, literally, biologically, molecularly present in every cell of your body. This is not a comfortable question, but it is the most important one. Let us look at what modern Argentine science is doing with these revelations. Because this story does not end in a laboratory with a shocking result and then silence. The science has begun to move into the culture. Slowly, unevenly, with resistance in some quarters and extraordinary openness in others. But it is moving. In 2017, a major study published by Argentine researchers at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research, known by its Spanish acronym CONICET, analyzed the genetic composition of over 3,000 individuals from across all Argentine provinces. The results confirmed and expanded everything previous smaller studies had suggested. The indigenous maternal contribution to the Argentine gene pool was not a minor footnote. It was a foundation. In 11 of Argentina's 23 provinces, the indigenous mitochondrial lineages represented the majority of the maternal ancestry of the population. 11 provinces where more than half the mothers going back through history were daughters of the pre-Columbian world. The study was published. It was discussed in academic circles. And then something unexpected happened. It began to circulate on social media. Argentine people began sharing it not as a political argument, but as a personal discovery. The comment sections of Argentine news articles covering the study filled with people writing things like, "My grandmother always said we had indigenous blood, and everyone in the family told her she was wrong." Or, "I always wondered why my mother's side of the family had certain features that did not match our Spanish surname." Or simply, "I want to get tested. I want to know." A country began to look at itself differently, not all of it, not overnight. But the conversation shifted, and genetics was the catalyst. There is a woman named Elena. She lives in Córdoba, Argentina's second largest city. Her surname is Italian. Her father's family arrived from the Calabria region of southern Italy in 1922. Her mother's family has been in the Argentine interior since the colonial period, their surname Spanish. Their identity always described as simply Argentine, meaning European, meaning not indigenous. Elena took a DNA ancestry test in 2019. She was 34 years old. She expected to see Italian and Spanish percentages, and perhaps a small surprise or two. What she found was that 41% of her ancestry traced to indigenous American lineages, specifically to the Andean and Pampas regions. Her maternal haplogroup, the unbroken line from her mother to her mother's mother going back into the deepest past, was haplogroup C1b, one of the oldest and most distinctly South American mitochondrial lineages. A lineage that arrived on the American continent at the end of the last ice age and has been here ever since. Elena told an Argentine journalist that she sat with that result for 3 days before she could talk about it. Not because it disturbed her, but because it explained things. Small things. The way her mother cooked certain dishes that had no Italian or Spanish origin. The folk remedies her grandmother used that did not appear in any European herbal tradition. The particular relationship her mother's family had with the land of the Argentine interior. Not sentimental, not poetic, but practical and deep and wordless. The way you know a place not because you learned about it, but because something in your body already understood it. The DNA did not give Elena a new identity. It gave her permission to acknowledge an identity that was already there. Hidden, patient, waiting. And Elena's story is not unique. It is multiplying across Argentina right now. As genetic testing becomes more accessible and more culturally accepted, Argentines are discovering by the hundreds of thousands that the story their families told about themselves was incomplete. Not always wrong in its facts, but incomplete in its depth. Missing the chapters that happened before the European surnames arrived. Missing the women whose names were never recorded, but whose mitochondrial DNA was recorded in every child they ever brought into the world. This is the revolution that genetics is making in Argentina. Not a political revolution, not a revolution of borders or governments or economies, a revolution of self-knowledge, the quiet, private, deeply personal revolution of a person sitting alone with a genetic report and realizing that they are older than they thought, that they come from deeper roots than they knew, that the land beneath their feet is not foreign soil inherited from European ancestors who crossed an ocean. It is ancestral soil, recognized in the blood even when forgotten in the mind. Now let us speak about something that Argentine genetics reveals about all of humanity. Because Argentina is not just a story about one country. Argentina is a laboratory. A natural experiment in what happens when you take the full diversity of the human species, African, European, Asian through its indigenous American branch, Middle Eastern through its converso thread, and compress it into one geography over 5 centuries of violent and tender and complicated contact. What happens is Argentina. What happens is a people who look European and carry indigenous blood, who speak Spanish and dream in a rhythm that comes from African drumming and Andean melody, who eat Italian food and drink pre-Columbian tea in a pre-Columbian gourd through a pre-Columbian drinking straw, who mourn their indigenous heritage in public while carrying it privately in their cells, who built a European city on a pampas that remembers everything. What happens is the proof of something that genetics has been quietly demonstrating for decades, while nationalism has been loudly arguing the opposite. There are no pure peoples. There never were. Everywhere that humans have lived for more than a few generations, they have mixed. They have loved across every boundary that culture tried to draw. They have created children who belong to multiple worlds simultaneously. The dream of racial purity is not just morally wrong, it is biologically illiterate. It describes